It was a chilly autumn morning, and the diner had just opened for the day. The faint aroma of fresh coffee mixed with the soft hum of conversations from the few early risers who'd stopped by for a quick breakfast. Among them was Emily, a hard-working waitress known for her warm smile and kind heart. She was used to the early shifts, the hurried footsteps of people coming and going, and the occasional stranger passing through town. But nothing could have prepared her for what was about to happen that day. As she wiped down the counter, she noticed a man lingering outside the diner. He was wrapped in a tattered coat, his shoulders hunched against the cold wind. His face was weary, etched with lines that told stories of hardship. Emily had seen him before, just once or twice in the area, but something about him struck her differently today. Maybe it was the way he hesitated, as though debating whether to step inside. Or perhaps it was the subtle sadness in his eyes, the kind that couldn't be ignored. Without thinking twice, Emily walked over to the door and opened it, letting the warmth of the diner spill out into the cold street. "Would you like to come in?" she asked softly, her voice kind but firm. The man looked startled, almost as if he wasn't used to being addressed with such kindness. After a brief pause, he nodded and stepped inside, his movements careful and uncertain. Emily guided him to a corner booth, away from the curious glances of other patrons. "Coffee?" she asked, and when he nodded again, she poured him a steaming cup and set it down with a plate of scrambled eggs and toast. It wasn't much, but it was enough to bring some color back to his pale face. "Take your time," she said with a gentle smile before walking away to tend to her other customers. For the next hour, the man quietly ate his meal, occasionally dancing around the diner as if taking in the normalcy of it all. Emily couldn't help but watch him from afar, curious about who he was and what had brought him to this point. There was something about him, a quiet dignity beneath the layers of exhaustion, that piqued her interest. When the man finished, he looked up at her with gratitude shining in his tired eyes. "Thank you," he said simply, his voice hoarse but sincere. Emily waved it off with a light laugh. "It's nothing," she replied. But as the man stood up to leave, he hesitated, reaching into his pocket. What he pulled out left Emily frozen in place. Her heart raced as he handed her a small, worn envelope. "You don't know who I am," he said quietly, "but you will soon." And just like that, he walked out of the diner, disappearing into the bustling streets. Emily stood there, the envelope in her hands, 1,000 questions racing through her mind. Who was he? What was inside the envelope? And why did he seem so familiar? Little did she know this simple act of kindness would change her life forever. Emily stood there for a moment longer, staring at the envelope in her hand. It was light, barely heavier than an empty envelope should be. The edges were worn, as if it had been carried around for a long time. Her fingers brushed over the paper, and for a moment she hesitated. She wanted to open it right there, in the middle of the diner, but something held her back. What if it wasn't meant for her? What if opening it changed something she wasn't ready for? The sound of a chair scraping across the floor snapped her back to reality. A group of customers was getting ready to leave, and the other tables still needed her attention. Emily slid the envelope into the pocket of her apron and took a deep breath, forcing herself to focus on the rest of her shift. But no matter how hard she tried, her thoughts kept drifting back to the mysterious man and his strange words. By the time the lunch crowd had thinned out, Emily was exhausted. She finally found a moment to slip into the back room, away from the noise and the curious glances of her coworkers. Sitting down on a worn-out stool, she pulled the envelope out of her pocket and studied it more closely. There was no name, no return address, just a faint scent of something she couldn't quite place. Her hands trembled slightly as she opened it, carefully sliding out a single folded piece of paper. The handwriting was neat but hurried, as though the writer had been in a rush or under pressure. The words were simple, yet they carried a weight that made Emily's chest tighten. Asterisk, "You showed me kindness when no one else would. I can never repay you for that. But I want you to know the truth. There's more to my story than you realize, and soon you'll understand. Until then, trust that this moment was meant to happen." The letter ended abruptly. It wasn't by chance. No signature, no hint of who the man was or why he had chosen her to receive it. Emily read it over and over, hoping to find some hidden meaning in the words, but each time she was left with the same questions. Who was he? Why did he seem so familiar? And what truth was he talking about? Emily tucked the letter back into the envelope and slipped it into her purse. She didn't know what to do with it, or who to share it with, if anyone at all. For now, she decided to keep it to herself. That evening, as she walked home under the dim glow of streetlights, Emily couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched. She glanced over her shoulder more than once, but the sidewalks were empty, save for the occasional passing car. The city always had a way of making her feel both surrounded and utterly alone. When she finally reached her small apartment, she locked the door behind her and leaned against it, letting out a long breath. The silence of her home felt comforting yet unnerving. She kicked off her shoes and set her purse on the counter, her thoughts still tangled around the man and his cryptic note. Emily didn't consider herself a superstitious person, but there was something about the way the man had spoken to her, the way his eyes had lingered on hers, that left her uneasy. It was as if he had seen right through her, into the parts of her life she kept hidden even from herself. Over the next few days, the memory of their encounter refused to fade. Every time she walked to work, she found herself scanning the streets, half expecting to see him again. But he was never there. The booth where he had sat remained empty, and the diner seemed quieter without him, as if a strange energy had left with him. Emily's co-workers noticed her distraction, though she tried to brush it off. "You okay, Em?" one of them asked as they were closing up one night. "Yeah," she replied with a forced smile. "Just tired, that's all." But she wasn't okay. She felt like she was caught in a web of unanswered questions, and the more she tried to unravel it, the more tangled she became. One evening, after another long shift, Emily decided to do something she hadn't done in years. She walked to the library. It was an old building, its tall windows glowing softly against the dark sky. She didn't know exactly what she was looking for, but she felt drawn there, as if the answers she needed might somehow be hidden among the shelves of dusty books. Inside, the air smelled of paper and ink, and the quiet hum of fluorescent lights made the space feel both serene and eerie. Emily wandered through the aisles, her fingers brushing against the spines of books. She found herself in the section dedicated to local history and flipped through a few volumes searching for what? A name? A face? She didn't find anything that night, but her curiosity only grew stronger. Over the next week, she returned to the library whenever she could, diving deeper into the archives. She read about the city's past, its people, its secrets. And though she still didn't find anything directly connected to the man, she began to notice patterns. Stories of strangers who had come and gone, leaving behind traces of mystery that were never fully explained. One story in particular stood out to her. It was about a man who had lived on the streets years ago, known by locals as the Wanderer. He had a reputation for appearing when people least expected it, offering words of wisdom or small acts of kindness before vanishing without a trace. Some said he had once been wealthy but had lost everything. Others believed he was running from a past too painful to face. The more Emily read about him, the more she wondered if there could be a connection. The description of the Wanderer didn't perfectly match the man she had met, but there were enough similarities to make her pause. Could it be possible that this man was following the Wanderer's footsteps, or even connected to him in some way? The questions swirled in her mind, each one leading to another, until she felt like she was chasing shadows. She thought about asking someone for help, a friend, a coworker, anyone who might know more than she did. But every time she tried to bring it up, the words caught in her throat. It was as if some part of her knew that this was something she had to figure out on her own. And so, late at night, when the rest of the city was asleep, Emily would sit by her window, staring out at the empty streets, clutching the letter in her hand. And when he did, know what she would be ready for, but she couldn't shake the feeling that the man would return. Days turned into weeks, and the man remained a mystery. Emily went through the motions of her daily life, but she couldn't stop thinking about him or the letter he had left behind. It felt like a puzzle missing most of its pieces. and no matter how hard she tried to piece it together, she kept coming up short. One evening, as she was closing up the diner, a strange feeling washed over her, like the air had shifted. She glanced out the window and saw a figure standing across the street, partially hidden in the shadows. For a moment, her heart raced. Was it him? She squinted, trying to make out the person's face, but before she could step closer, the figure turned and walked away. Emily felt a pull to follow, but the rational part of her hesitated. What if it wasn't him? Or worse, what if it was someone dangerous? She stayed rooted to the spot, watching until the figure disappeared into the night. As she locked the doors and walked home, she couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched. The following morning, something unusual happened. A regular customer at the diner, an elderly man named Mr. Carter, mentioned seeing a homeless man who matched the description of the one Emily had helped. He was sitting near the old library, Mr. Carter said, stirring his coffee absent-mindedly. Seemed like he was waiting for something, or someone. Emily's stomach tightened. Could it really be him? She debated whether to go, unsure she was ready for whatever answers he might have. But her curiosity won out. That afternoon, after her shift ended, Emily made her way to the library. The streets were quieter than usual, the crisp autumn air carrying the scent of fallen leaves. As she approached the library, she scanned the area, her eyes darting from one corner to the next. At first, she didn't see anyone, and disappointment settled in her chest. But then, just as she was about to turn back, she spotted him. He was sitting on a bench near the entrance, his tattered coat wrapped tightly around him. He looked exactly as she remembered. Tired, weathered, but with an air of quiet strength. For a moment, Emily froze. She had spent so much time thinking about this moment, but now that it was here, she didn't know what to say. Finally, she gathered her courage and approached him. "Hi," she said softly, her voice trembling slightly. The man looked up, his eyes meeting hers. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then he gave a small nod, as if he had been expecting her. "Hello, Emily," he said, his voice calm but heavy with meaning. Her breath caught. How did he know her name? She hadn't told him during their first encounter, and she was certain no one else had mentioned it. "You remember me," she said, more as a statement than a question. "I remember kindness," he replied, his gaze steady. "And I remember the people who show it." Emily sat down on the bench beside him, her heart pounding. "Who are you?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. The man hesitated, as though searching for the right words. "I'm someone who's been searching," he said finally, "for a place to belong. For people who understand that the smallest gestures can change a life." It wasn't the answer she had hoped for, but there was a sincerity in his voice that made her want to trust him. "Why did you leave me that letter?" she pressed. He looked away, his eyes distant. "Because you needed to know that what you did mattered," he said. "You didn't have to help me that day, but you did. And that act of kindness, it has a way of rippling out, touching things you can't see yet." Emily frowned, frustration bubbling up inside her. "But why me?" she asked. "Why not someone else?" The man turned back to her, his expression unreadable. "Because you remind me of someone," he said quietly. "Someone I lost a long time ago." Before Emily could ask what he meant, the man stood up. "I can't stay," he said, his voice firm. "Not yet." "Wait," Emily said, rising to her feet. "You can't just leave again. I need answers." He gave her a sad smile. "You'll find them," he said, "when the time is right." And with that, he walked away, leaving Emily standing there, more confused than ever. That night, as she lay in bed, Emily replayed the conversation over and over in her mind. Who was he? What had he meant about losing someone? And why did she feel like she had somehow been drawn into something much bigger than herself? Over the next few days, strange things began to happen. She noticed small details she hadn't before, like how the regulars at the diner seemed more thoughtful, more willing to connect with each other. One customer paid for a stranger's meal. Another left a generous tip with a note of gratitude. It was as if the man's words about kindness rippling out were coming true. But Emily couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to the story, something hidden beneath the surface, waiting to be uncovered. Then one morning, as she was getting ready for work, she found another envelope slipped under her door. Her hands shook as she picked it up, recognizing the same worn paper and familiar handwriting. Inside was a single sentence. Asterisk, look for the light where the shadows fall. Asterisk. Emily stared at the note, her mind racing. What did it mean? Was it a clue? A warning? Whatever it was, she knew one thing for certain. The mystery was far from over. Emily stared at the note in her hands for what felt like an eternity. The words asterisk, look for the light where the shadows fall asterisk echoed in her mind like a riddle she couldn't solve. It felt cryptic yet purposeful, as though the man had chosen each word carefully, knowing it would leave her both intrigued and frustrated. She turned the envelope over, hoping for another clue, but it was empty. The day dragged on as she tried to make sense of it. At the diner, she went through her routine on autopilot, her mind consumed with thoughts of the man and his mysterious messages. Every sound, every movement in the corner of her eye made her think he might appear again. But he didn't. That evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Emily decided she couldn't sit idly by anymore. She pulled the note out once more, reading it aloud. Look for the light where the shadows fall, she whispered. What light? What shadows? Her thoughts raced. The city's library came to mind again. It was a place filled with both light and shadow, with its grand, sunlit reading rooms and dark, quiet corners. And it was the last place she had seen him. Deciding it was worth a shot, she grabbed her coat and headed out, the crisp evening air biting at her skin, as she walked quickly through the streets. The library was quiet where she arrived, the kind of quiet that felt alive, humming with the weight of untold stories. Emily wandered through the aisles, unsure of what she was looking for, but unwilling to leave until she found something. Anything that could bring her closer to the truth. Her eyes scanned the shelves, the tables, the corners. Nothing seemed out of place. She felt a pang of doubt. Maybe she was grasping at straws, chasing after something that wasn't even there. But just as she was about to give up, she noticed something peculiar. In one of the darker corners of the library, where the shelves were older and less frequented, a faint beam of light was shining through a small crack in the wall. It seemed out of place, almost unnatural, given the dimness of the area. Emily approached it cautiously, her heart pounding. As she got closer, she realized the light was illuminating a single book on the shelf. It was old, its spine cracked and faded, the title barely legible. She reached out and pulled it free, the musty smell of aged paper filling her nose. The book didn't seem special at first, just a collection of stories about the city's history. But as she flipped through the pages, something fell out. It was another envelope, identical to the others, with her name written on the front. Emily's hands trembled as she opened it, her breath catching in her throat. Inside was another note, this one longer than the last. Asterisk, the answers you seek are closer than you think. You've already crossed paths with them. Look to the past to understand the present, and trust your instincts. This is bigger than you, Emily, much bigger. Asterisk. Her mind reeled. What did it mean that she'd already crossed paths with the answers? And what could possibly be bigger than her in this strange, unfolding story? She couldn't shake the feeling that the man was leading her on a deliberate path, one she didn't fully understand, but couldn't turn away from. The next few days were a blur of uncertainty and unease. Emily tried to piece together everything she knew, but the fragments refused to fit. She thought about the people she had met recently, the stories she had heard, and the places she had visited, searching for some thread that might tie it all together. And then something happened that changed everything. One night, as she was walking home from the diner, she noticed a black car parked across the street from her apartment. It wasn't a car she recognized, and it didn't seem like it belonged to any of her neighbors. Her unease grew when she realized the driver was still inside, their silhouette barely visible through the tinted windows. Emily quickened her pace, her pulse racing. She reached her apartment and hurried inside, locking the door behind her. Peeking through the curtains, she saw the car still there, its headlights off, but its engine faintly humming. She tried to calm herself, telling herself it was just a coincidence, but deep down she knew it wasn't. Someone was watching her. The next morning the car was gone, but Emily couldn't shake the feeling that she was being followed. She started noticing small things. Strangers lingering a little too long outside the diner, the same figure appearing in different places as she went about her day. And then came the final straw. One evening, as she returned to her apartment, she found her door slightly ajar. Panic gripped her as she pushed it open, her heart pounding in her chest. Inside, everything looked normal, except for one thing. Sitting on her kitchen table was another envelope. This time, there was no note, only a photograph. It showed the man she had helped at the diner, standing with another figure Emily didn't recognize. They were outside what looked like an old factory, the building crumbling and overgrown with weeds. On the back of the photograph, a single word was written, *come. Emily's breath hitched. She knew this wasn't just a coincidence anymore. The man was leading her somewhere, and he wanted her to follow. But why? And what would she find when she got there? Her fear mixed with determination. She had come too far to turn back now. Whatever answers lay at the end of this road, she had to know. With the photograph in her hand and the weight of uncertainty pressing down on her, Emily set out, not knowing that she was walking straight into the heart of the mystery, and toward the most intense moment of her life. Emily clutched the photograph tightly as she made her way to the address she had deciphered from the faint street sign in the background. The factory looked even more foreboding in person than it had in the picture. The once grand structure was now a decaying skeleton of metal and concrete, its windows shattered and vines crawling up the walls. A cold wind swept through the area, carrying with it an eerie silence that seemed to press against her chest. As she approached the entrance, she couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched. She turned around, scanning her surroundings, but saw nothing except the empty street and the distant glow of streetlights. With a deep breath, she stepped inside, her footsteps echoing the cavernous space. The factory was dark, the only light coming from the moon filtering through the broken windows. Dust floated in the air, and the faint smell of rust and mildew clung to everything. Emily's eyes adjusted to the dimness as she moved cautiously through the maze of machinery and debris. She followed the faint sound of something, a hum, or maybe whispers, coming from deeper within the building. Her heartbeat quickened with each step, the weight of the photograph still in her pocket reminding her of why she was there. But as she rounded a corner, she froze. In the middle of the room stood a figure. It wasn't the man she had been expecting, but someone else entirely, a woman, tall and poised, with piercing eyes that seemed to cut through the shadows. She wore a long coat, her hands clasped in front of her as though she had been waiting for Emily. "You've come," the woman said, her voice calm but carrying an edge that sent chills down Emily's spine. "Who are you?" Emily asked, her voice shaking slightly. "And what is this place?" The woman tilted her head, studying Emily with a look that made her feel as though she were being weighed and measured. "This place," the woman began, gesturing around them, "is where it all began. And who I am? Well, that depends on what you want to know." Emily took a step forward, her fear mingling with frustration. "I've been led here, given cryptic notes and clues. I want to know what's going on. Who is he? The man I helped at the diner. Why does he keep sending me these messages?" The woman's expression softened, just slightly. "Ah, yes. Him. He has a way of weaving people into his plans without their full understanding. But you're different. He saw something in you, something that even you might not realize yet." Emily's mind raced. "Saw what? What are you talking about?" The woman stepped closer, her voice lowering. "Do you remember what he said to you? About kindness rippling out, about how even the smallest actions can change lives. He wasn't just talking about your act of compassion that day. He was talking about a much bigger chain of events, one that you are now a part of." Before Emily could respond, a sound behind her made her spin around. It was faint at first, like the creak of a door, but then it grew louder, footsteps echoing through the factory. She turned back to the woman, panic rising in her chest. "Who else is here?" Emily demanded. The woman's gaze didn't waver. "You'll see soon enough. But be careful. Things aren't always what they seem." The footsteps grew closer, and then, out of the shadows, the man from the diner emerged. His presence filled the room with a strange, charged energy, his eyes locking onto Emily's with an intensity that made her breath catch. "I knew you'd come," he said, his voice steady but tinged with something Emily couldn't quite place. Relief, maybe, or regret. "You," Emily said, her voice trembling. "You brought me here. Why? What is this all about?" The man hesitated, his eyes flickering to the woman before returning to Emily. "Because you deserve to know the truth. But the truth isn't easy, and it's not without risk." The woman stepped forward, her tone sharp. "Are you sure she's ready? This isn't just about her anymore. It's about all of us." Emily's frustration boiled over. "Enough with the riddles. Tell me what's going on." The man sighed, his shoulders slumping slightly. "You helped me when no one else would," he said. "And that act of kindness, it wasn't random. It was a spark, Emily. A spark that could light something much bigger." Before he could explain further, a sudden noise shattered the moment. A loud crash from somewhere above them. Emily looked up, her heart racing as the sound of heavy footsteps echoed through the factory. "They found us," the woman said, her voice urgent. "Who?" Emily asked, her panic rising. "Who's found us?" The man grabbed her arm, pulling her toward a hidden staircase. "There's no time to explain. You have to trust me." Emily hesitated for a fraction of a second, her mind racing with questions. But something in his eyes, the same quiet strength she had seen that day at the diner, made her follow him. As they descended into the darkness, the noise above grew louder, a sense of danger pressing in from all sides. Emily didn't know what she was running from or what she was running toward, but one thing was clear. The mystery was far from over, and the stakes were higher than she'd ever imagined. The staircase was narrow and steep, the walls pressing in on either side, as Emily followed the man deeper into the darkness. Her breathing was ragged, her heart pounding with fear and adrenaline. Behind them, the sounds of pursuit grew louder, heavy footsteps and distant voices echoing through the factory. "Where are we going?" she whispered urgently, her voice barely audible over the creaking of the old wooden steps. "Somewhere safe," the man replied without looking back. "Somewhere they can't find us." Emily wanted to demand answers, to stop and make sense of everything, but the urgency in his voice pushed her forward. The staircase ended abruptly, opening into a small underground chamber lit by a single flickering bulb. The woman was right behind them, closing the heavy door with a grunt and sliding a rusted metal bar across it. "This won't hold them for long," the woman said, her tone sharp. Emily turned to the man, her frustration boiling over. "Who are they? And why are they chasing us?" The man hesitated, his face shadowed in the dim light. "They're people who don't want the truth to come out," he said finally. "People who have too much to lose if the world changes." Emily's mind reeled. What truth? What could I possibly know that's worth all of this? The woman stepped forward, her gaze steady. "It's not just about you, Emily. It's about what you represent. You're proof that even in a world full of indifference, one act of kindness can ignite something bigger. You're a threat to those who thrive on fear and control." The words hung in the air, heavy with meaning. Emily shook her head, trying to process everything. "That doesn't make any sense," she said. "I'm just a waitress. I don't have any power." "That's where you're wrong," the man said, his voice quiet but firm. "Power isn't about money or influence. It's about people. It's about hope. And you've given people something they haven't felt in a long time. A reason to believe things can change." Before Emily could respond, a loud crash echoed from above, followed by the sound of splintering wood. The woman's expression darkened. "They're here," she said. The man moved quickly, pulling a small device from his pocket. It looked like a simple radio, but when he pressed a button, a low hum filled the room. "What is that?" Emily asked, her voice trembling. Insurance, he replied. If they get too close, this will give us a few seconds to escape. The footsteps were closer now, pounding against the floor above them. Emily's fear was palpable, but so was her growing determination. She didn't fully understand what was happening, but she knew one thing: she couldn't let these people win. The door above burst open, and voices filled the chamber. The man grabbed Emily's hand, pulling her toward another hidden door at the back of the room. The woman stayed behind, holding the device in her hand like a lifeline. Go, she said firmly. I'll hold them off. Emily hesitated, her heart aching at the thought of leaving the woman behind. But the man tugged at her arm, his expression leaving no room for argument. They ran down a narrow tunnel, the walls damp and cold. The sound of pursuit grew faint, but Emily's mind was racing. Why had the woman stayed behind? What was so important that they were willing to risk everything? The tunnel opened into a small, hidden exit. Outside, the night was still and quiet, the stars shining brightly overhead. Emily turned to the man, her frustration boiling over. Enough, she said, her voice shaking. No more running. No more riddles. I want answers, and I want them now. The man sighed, his shoulders slumping slightly. You deserve the truth, he said. But it's not what you think. He reached into his pocket and pulled out another photograph. This one was older, the edges worn and the image faded. It showed a young girl standing in front of a house, her smile wide and innocent. Emily's breath caught as she recognized the girl. It was her. What is this? She asked, her voice barely above a whisper. It's where this all started, the man said. You don't remember, but you and I crossed paths a long time ago. You were just a child, but your kindness saved my life. I've been searching for a way to repay that debt ever since. Tears filled Emily's eyes as the memories began to surface. Faint, fleeting images of a man on the street, her mother giving him food and shelter, her own small hands handing him a warm coat. You've been following me because of that, she asked, her voice breaking. Because you reminded me that there's still good in the world, he said. And because I knew you had the strength to make a difference. The sound of distant sirens broke the moment, pulling them back to the present. We have to keep moving, the man said. Emily nodded, her resolve hardening. She didn't have all the answers, but she knew one thing. She wasn't just running anymore. She was fighting for something bigger than herself. A spark of hope in a world that desperately needed it. As they disappeared into the night, Emily felt a strange sense of clarity. The journey wasn't over, but for the first time she knew where it was leading, and she was ready for whatever came next.